Good morning. It's the nicest way I know to tell people to be quiet. That was potentially disastrous. What do we have on our prayer list? Obviously, we have Jay still. Anybody to add? Anybody to call out in particular? Barbara Cunningham's granddaughter, Gracie. Rachel Montgomery. Brenda Montgomery, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Okay. Anyone else? David? Amen. Thank you. One of the things we need to keep in mind is that as we go through this, unless we have language that says the next day or 3 days later or something like that, we have to remember that these are chapters. So we really don't know what the timeline is between these incidences. Not that that's a big deal, but it's just something I think that we should keep in mind. When we get into chapter 9, this is an interesting interaction with a lot of nuances that hopefully we'll be able to pick out and pay enough attention to. So let me go ahead and read through the chapter real quick, and then we'll come back through it. It's chapter 9 of Joshua. Now it came about when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland and on all the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard of it, that they gathered themselves together with one accord to fight with Joshua and with Israel. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard that what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they also acted craftily and set out as envoys and took worn-out sacks on their donkeys and wineskins, and worn out and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and become crumbled. Well, let me stop. Let me point out something here. In this language, let's take a look at verse 4. Look at the language there. They also acted craftily. So contextually, that would imply that the kings who were getting ready to take on Joshua were acting in a crafty manner as well. These are some of the nuances that I want to make sure that we don't miss in this chapter. We don't have as much of an account as what we're going to see with the Gibeonites, but nonetheless, like I said, there's a lot of nuances in here. And picking up with verse 6, and they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, we have come from a far country. Now, therefore, make a covenant with us. And the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you are living within our land. How then shall we make a covenant with you? But they said to Joshua, we are your servants. Then Joshua said to them, who are you, and where do you come from? And they said to him, "Your servants have come from a very far country because of the fame of the Lord your God, for we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon king of Heshbon, and to Og king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, 'Take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go to meet them and say to them, we are your servants now, then make a covenant with us. This our bread was warm when we took it for our provisions out of our houses on the day that we left to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and has become crumbled. And these wineskins which we filled were new, and behold, they are torn, and these are clothes, and our sandals are worn out because of our very long journey.' So the men of Israel took some of their provisions and did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. And it came about at the end of 3 days that after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were neighbors and that they were living within their land. Then the sons of Israel set out and came to their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon and Chephirah and Beeroth and Yes. And the sons of Israel did not strike them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. But all the leaders said to the whole congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we cannot touch them. This we will do to them, even let them live, lest wrath be upon us for the oath which we swore to them." And the leaders said to them, "Let them live." So they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole congregation, just as the leaders had spoken to them. Then Joshua called for them and spoke to them, saying, "Why have you deceived us, saying, 'We are very far from you,' when you are living within our land? Now therefore you are cursed, and you shall never cease being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God." So they answered Joshua and said, "Because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore we feared greatly for our lives because of you, and we have done this thing. And now behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us." Thus he did to them and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place in which he would choose. So we got a bunch of liars. Bunch of cowards and liars. That's what the Gibeonites were. It's just, they were afraid, so they disguised themselves. There's some interesting things here as we go through this. One of the first things that I want to point out is they went to great deals of effort to contrive this lie. Let me back up a second. The Gibeonites, Hivites, Horites, they all appear to reference the same group of people. They are descendants of Canaan, the sons of Ham, and that goes back to Genesis 36 and 2. In 2 Samuel 21, we see, "So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites." Okay, so they belonged to the same groups of people from Ai and from Jericho that Joshua had already annihilated. They had a right to be fearful. But again, it's the length that they went to this ruse. I mean, look at what they did. They were only 3 days away. Okay, so they couldn't obviously just pack up stuff and go because it would have been real obvious. So they choose worn out stuff, old torn up stuff on purpose. They would go and find bread that was probably thrown out and took that. And they put this all together, and then they sell this off as a long journey. One of the first things I find interesting is that the people of Israel challenged them. So how do we know? How do we know you don't live here? They never answered. They go to Joshua. Okay, so what do we see here? There's a couple things we see here. What's the first thing that we see in this encounter from Joshua's standpoint? He does not have a lot of information, no.
And the information he's getting is secondhand from the people.
Well, to begin with, but no, if you'll see, he actually confronts them. So, verse 6, and they went to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal. Okay, so the people, now obviously they were all gathered together here. Okay, the people challenge them. They turn away from the people and they go straight to Joshua. Say, Joshua, make a covenant with us. What's the first problem that we see here? Do what? Very first thing is that he did not go to the Lord and find out if these people were being upfront, did he? Okay. There's a real subtle thing here. Joshua challenges them. Verse 8. Joshua said to them, who are you and where do you come from? Do they answer his question? Yes, ma'am. This is something that I noticed several times. Joshua, rightfully so, gets a lot of credit for serving God, for leading Israel along the orders and the directions of God. But Joshua was a man. And at this point in time, he was a very powerful man. Okay, he had just come off of 2 annihilations, and other than the one time when he didn't go to the Lord and they lost 36 soldiers, we don't have any record of them losing any soldiers. But here we see the same problem happening again, huh? Like you say, you see Joshua's ego come through. So, did they answer Joshua's question? No. I'm sorry? Yeah. Who are you? And where do you come from? They did not say where they came from, just from a distant country. Okay? If you're being up front and you're from Egypt, why wouldn't you say you were from Egypt? Joshua accepts this vague and half answer and says, okay, I'll make a covenant with you. I want to take a look at verse 11. Okay? So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions in your hand from the journey and go to meet and say to them, we are your servants now, make a covenant with us. What is missing from this passage?
Who they are servants of.
Well, yes, but something a little more subtle. It says their elders sent them, doesn't it? It doesn't say their king sent them. Okay, and there's historical evidence that the Gibeonites did not have a king, that they were a republic. Okay? What is that? A republic overseen by their elders. What does that sound like? Mm-mm. Yes, but that's not what I'm thinking of. What are we? A constitutional republic overseen by elders, Congress. Okay. If we remember that the men that penned our Constitution were students of the Word, it's not that big of a stretch to think that they didn't possibly get some of their inspiration from this and from the study of the Gibeonites. So, just, again, a lot of subtle nuances that I wanted to point out in here. This would have been very, very different because virtually all the nations had kings. Israel did not at this time, and of course the Gibeonites, there's no indication the Gibeonites did. Okay. So without going to the Lord, Joshua makes peace with them and makes a covenant with them. Now, 3 days later, they find out about it. Didn't take long for the lie to get exposed, did it? But now they're in a quandary. From our standpoint, and I know Jim can back this up, they violated the terms of the covenant. They came to them under false pretenses. So in our culture, what would we do? We'd void the contract, right?
Void the contract because they put it.
Yeah, because it was entered into under false pretenses. Look at the Israelites. What do? It didn't matter what the Gibeonites did it? They had put their word out, and they were standing by their word and their sense of integrity. It's an interesting lesson for us, isn't it? Okay. What did they fear? They feared the wrath of God if they broke their word, huh? They weren't worried about the Gibeonites. They weren't worried about anybody else. They were worried about God's retribution for them breaking a covenant.
They followed the example of God because God honors his side of the covenant even though we break it.
Yep. Quick side note. In our culture, we don't understand covenants. We think we do, but we have no concept of covenants and how they played in this time frame. When a covenant was created, you were not going to break it. It would cost you blood if you broke that covenant. Okay, whether it was your blood or the blood of a child or something. But there was a punishment for breaking a covenant. Not like us where we go find loopholes to void contracts. Yeah. He does curse them. It's kind of like they knew, though. Yeah. So we already got what we wanted. Do what you will, but we know that you have limitations. That's kind of the implication that's here. The curse on Adam? Is that what you're referring? Yeah. Okay. The truth comes out, who would have told them? I mean, we're not specifically told here how the Israelites found out after 3 days. So who would have told the Israelites? Think God might have arranged to make sure they found out?
But they would have found that eventually because they were right there with other people right next door. So when they before they were attacked, they had to let Joshua know that these are our people.
You lost me.
Okay.
Either that or you're getting ahead of me.
I'm assuming that not the entire group went.
Oh, this would have been a real small
A very small group.
expeditionary party, yeah.
In order to protect the rest of the group, they would have had to tell Joshua who was included in the covenant, who their people were to keep them from being killed.
That's very possible. That's a possible explanation. If we keep in mind that Gibeon was about 14 miles, what did I find out? I want to say Gibeon was between, 18 to 20 miles away from Gilgal. Okay. If you're walking at 2 to 3 miles an hour like this, if you're in full battle array, that's going to cut that down quite a bit. So you might be looking at a mile and a half an hour, mile an hour, something like that. Point is, it was more than a day's journey to get there. So it's not like Joshua could stand up there and go, oh, there's Gibeon. It would have been past the horizon, out of his immediate sight. So 20 miles in 3 days, that's probably about, for normal transport, that's probably about right. So,
Because at the end of chapter 8, we're actually questioning where the aliens live in the moment. I'm sure at some point somebody came up to be like, yeah, no, they not fall here under them, or even Rahab could have possibly come or something.
it could have come that way too. We're just not told. All we're told is that mysteriously 3 days later they find out. Kind of like with Peter, huh? Aren't you? And it could very well be. Obviously, there was a lot of trade that went on at this time frame, and there was a lot of interaction. Of course, there wasn't a whole lot of people outside of the Israelites left alive in this immediate spot, because they had wiped them all out, except for the aliens. Yep. Yeah. Good point, Bobby. Look at verse 18. The sons of Israel did not strike them because of the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. Doesn't that sound typical? It also isn't the first time, is it? When would this congregation have grumbled against their leader? Moses in the wilderness, huh? Yeah. Why have you brought us out here to die? Constant grumbling. This is part of human nature. If we don't understand, if we're not part, then immediately we're critical. And now, do the people of Israel have a reason to be critical, though? Who were the first ones to challenge the Gibeonites? The people. People say, who are you? How do we know that you're not lying to us? Short version. That question never gets answered. Okay? The story gets repeated. The same kind of propaganda that we're subject to today, all through time. The hard questions don't get answered, the propaganda gets repeated until the propaganda is accepted. Yeah. Well, first, the very first and obvious thing is we need to get the input from the Lord, don't we? Yep. Okay. So yes, Joshua does punish them. Joshua does curse them and condemns them to be slaves. Now, I stopped short when I read 2 Samuel 21:2. I stopped short. That full passage reads, so the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. Okay, and that's recorded again in 2 Samuel. So we see that they remain slaves all the way through the time into Saul and to David. Okay, and that's a whole nother lesson, a whole nother study, but David has to pay a price for Saul's breaking of this covenant as well. Now, again, it's a different study. He does it with Saul's sons, but nonetheless, he had to pay a price for it. And that's part of what I was talking about with covenants and with blood being a retribution for when a covenant is broken. Okay. Any comments before we move on to chapter 10? Yes, sir. Yeah. And it doesn't. And you have to wonder why Joshua was so entertaining and not a whole lot more skeptical of these people. It's certainly, okay, I know I would have been a whole lot more skeptical. Now, it's hard to say with Joshua dealing with the entire nation of Israel and dealing with a long-term plan that God had given him to clean out all the inhabitants of the land so that the Israelites could then, down the road, divide the land up among the 12 tribes, etc. So obviously he had a lot on his plate, but still, it makes you wonder why he was so accommodating, why he didn't challenge it more. By the way, my name's Larry. But yeah, I'm not really a people person, okay? I think people have their place, and that's away from me. So I would be more cynical than perhaps I should be, but yeah, here you have a very specific set of instructions given to Joshua, and Joshua has achieved success when he's followed those instructions, and then he lets his guard down through his ego or other things that are going on or whatever. It's a real puzzling chapter to deal with in the whole context of Joshua. Yeah. Yeah. What is one commonality between all of the best, and I say best, all of the most successful lies? They all contain a shred of truth. Did you?
Just think about, we can look back in history, read this, and recognize that Joshua, and especially the leaders, should have known this was sought out. We can look back and say that now, in hindsight. Yet, fast forward to 2022, whether you're talking personal decisions, family decisions, or business, or whatever the decision may be, how many of us make the mistake of not putting a pause on whatever the circumstance is and spending time in meditation and prayer to God?
Yeah.
Now, I know that we don't talk to God the same way Joshua did in his day and time. But we do have the written word, and we do have the avenue of prayer. I personally believe that there is much wisdom to be learned in patience and prayer and meditation.
Absolutely.
On God's word. Because many of the answers that we are seeking are in his word, and oftentimes we don't find it because we don't seek his help in prayer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tom? Yep, and that's the reference from 2 Samuel as part of all of that. And I don't remember, it was either 6 or 7 of Saul's sons that David handed over to him. Yeah. I read it, I just don't remember whether it was 6 or 7. Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, Clayton, absolutely. In the construction industry, I try to remind people that it's not brain surgery, that they are never in such a hurry that they can't take 5 minutes and do it right. And that's really exactly what you're saying, is that we should never be in such a hurry that we can't take 5 minutes and get counsel from the Lord before we take action on things. All right, let's go ahead and start 10. We're not going to get very far into it. But some of this falls into context. Now, it came about when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, by the way, I want to point out something here. In my translation, king is a lowercase. Just one of those little things. That Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king. So he had done to Ai and its king, that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, that he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all of its men were mighty. Therefore Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem sent word to the other kings, "Come up and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and the sons of Israel." Don't you think that's kind of an interesting reaction? What would they have all had in common? They were all Amorites. Okay? So you have these other 5 kings and kingdoms looking at Gibeon. And when it talks about a royal city, it took me a while to find some clarity on this. The passage, one of the royal cities greater than Ai, it was not a regal city. It was not where a king resided, but it would have been like a capital type city. It would have had residences that warranted royal families staying there. Now, of course, we've already taken note that in all likelihood the Gibeonites did not have a king. So it still was an influential city. It obviously would have had to have a certain amount of wealth. It certainly commanded a certain amount of power in the region. And these kings are going, they just made a covenant with the Israelites, and the Israelites have just destroyed 2 huge cities, including a walled city. Don't you think that's an interesting reaction, that their reaction is, okay, let's all get together and go fight him? Well, they did see the Gibeonites. There's no question. Yeah, I think that's easy to conclude that they considered the Gibeonites traitors. Yeah. Gathered together, went up. Okay. But you notice they did not come at this point come together to battle Joshua. They came together to battle the Gibeonites. Okay, so they were obviously angry, taking retaliatory actions, but they weren't completely stupid. Okay. All right, when we take a look at verse 6, then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp of Gilgal, saying, "Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us." Let's take a step back and let's understand the context here. Okay, again, Gibeon was about 18 to 20 miles away. These other cities would have been other distances away, and you'll have to forgive me, I did not take the time to research the exact distances from all these cities. For a single messenger to have gone 20 miles would have taken an entire day easily. So at what point, I mean, you have to understand, you got these 5 armies that are coming at Gibeon. Gibeon had to have had scouts out and about and seen this army coming so that they could send somebody down to Israel, so they'd have time to react and do this. Okay, this is not guerrilla warfare where all of a sudden 5 armies stand up and they start attacking the city. So we've got to keep the context of a warfare and the time in mind. It's not like what we can do today. Okay, so they send a message down to Joshua. And let's pick up verse 7. So Joshua went from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him and all the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. Okay, based on previous chapters, when it talks about the men of war and the valiant warriors, how many was that? At least 30,000, huh? Okay. 30,000 warriors, men. Now it says men of war and valiant warriors. So I really don't know if that valiant warriors was included in that 30,000 of men of war, or if it was 30,000 soldiers and the valiant warriors were the commanders. I don't know. I don't know. If somebody with a little more knowledge of that might be able to help me out there. But in any case, this is a huge number of people that
I find it interesting, there's no written record that I found that indicates Joshua going to the war at the request of Gideon, the people of Gideon. There's no information that leads me to believe that Joshua sought the Lord or God's advice. Should we answer their need for help, or should we let the Amorite overrun?
no, there's an inference. You can infer that that happened because in verse 8 it says, and the Lord said to Joshua. So you can infer that Joshua asked the Lord because there's no occurrences before that where God stepped up front. God answered Joshua when Joshua went to him. And if you follow that logic, then we can infer that Joshua went to God and God said, go for it. I got your back. But yeah, you're right. That's an interesting deduction. I hadn't considered that deduction. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, you see Joshua's reaction once he puts his warrior group together and the Lord tells Joshua, don't fear him, go for it, I got you. Joshua, with 30,000 people, travels all night long. And one of the commentators made a comment that he would have traveled all day and all night in order to be there the next morning, and that makes sense. 30,000 people going 20 miles on foot, that's not something that's going to happen very quickly. So it would make sense that they traveled most of the day or whatever part of the day was left after they got assembled and got going, and then kept going. In verse 9, and Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. Verse 10 is an interesting verse. And the Lord confounded them before Israel, and he slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. Confounded. Picture this, okay? We don't know how big of an army the 5 kings had put together. We have no idea. We do know that Joshua would have been somewhere in the 30,000 range. The commentators indicated that based on this language, that by traveling all day and all night, Joshua surprised them by being there so quickly. And that they had barely had a chance to coordinate their forces to prepare the attack on Gibeon, because we don't have any record that they actually attacked Gibeon, just that they were in march to get there. So again, there's a lot of interesting things that if we really pay attention to. Obviously, confounded means to confuse or to daze or to there was another word that was used, panic them. The ESV version translates that word panic. So Matthew Henry contends that the army of Israel pounced on the armies of the 5 kings before they even had a chance to get the fight going against Gibeon, hence the confusion. And that makes sense too. If you think about, you've got these kings with their generals, and they're all trying to coordinate their army to attack Gibeon, which was a great city, obviously had defenses. And all of a sudden, you've got 30,000 people crawling up your backside. It's going to create mass confusion. I think we're going to stop there. Because what we're going to see is we're going to see a couple miracles that happen in this chapter. And I don't want to shortchange those 2 miracles. So, any last comments? Bobby, would you close?
Lord, Heavenly Father, you are the great I am. This is your day, the Lord's day, the blessed day that you ask that your soul is you see fit. Life of Christ, and the first of his love and Calvary. God, you with us, so thankful to be here. We can study your word, help us to apply what we learn today in our lives, help ourselves, and help our friends and family, in Jesus, help us to learn to always consult you and all that we do, and take the time and effort to seek your approval and your guidance and wisdom in everything that we endeavor. God, you with us with the rest of our meeting service. God, you command every leadership, led within the family. Help us, Lord, to do everything that we need to sight and commit Jesus and death and power in the living prayer.
Thank you.